he's telling about her, um, they're so happy with their Quest service.
Oh, yeah?
And in the meantime, she's talking on this commercial, and her husband is going moonwalking and doing all kinds of stuff.
back that way.
And I said, that is what Dad would be doing.
Okay, now that Grandma's done, we'll start the interview with Zach.
You get to start,
Gotcha.
You what? Oh, you gotta buzz that out.
Zach.
You can go ahead and start, Zach.
Okay, this is Zach Gannon, me. Okay, yeah, we all know. And today my grandpa, Bill Gannon, will tell us some stories about his life. It is January the 2nd on 2006 at his house. Grandpa, what would you like to tell me about your life?
Well, starting at the beginning, I was born August 10th, 1939, which is about 2 weeks before the start of World War II when Hitler invaded Poland. I was the second generation on my dad's side from Ireland and the fourth generation on my mother's side from Norway and Sweden. When I was born, it was in, the folks lived in Armour, South Dakota. My dad was county agent there. But by the time I was 2 years old, we moved on to the family farm up by Del Rapids, and I grew up on that farm. I can remember as a child, a young man, that we farmed with horses, and we had 2 teams of horses. And then as I grew older, we got switched over to using tractors. I can remember the water system being put in, the electricity and the telephone being put in on the farm. And of course I grew up on horses. I rode horses all the way through until I graduated from high school. I went to school in Del Rapids at St. Mary's High School, and we drove every day to school. My brother drove the bus when he was a senior, and then the bus broke down. So I drove the car and picked up some neighbor kids on the way in when I was the last couple of years of high school. I met Grandma. She was a car hop at the drive-in in Del Rapids. And I took her out a few times when she got off of work, and sort of got hooked. We got married in 1961 and settled in Sioux Falls. We've lived in Sioux Falls most of our lives. However, we did live a short time in Grand Forks and in Phoenix, Arizona, and in Orange County, California. But Sioux Falls is home for us, and we're back here to stay. Worked for John Morrell and Company and at night, and went to college during the day at Augustana College until I got my bachelor's degree, and then spent a total of about 20 years with Morrell, and by the time I got done I was in the corporate staff. Then left them and went to work in a couple of various positions until I started doing home loans in California, and then did home loans in back here in South Dakota at Core Trust Bank. I had about 20 years of home mortgages. Now have 5 children, 7 grandchildren, 2 great-grandchildren, and they're still coming. Yeah. Yeah. Are you ready?
Okay.
Yeah. Now we were talking about me and the horses when I was a kid. First horse I had was Laddie Pony. I got him for Christmas, and when we came outside Christmas Eve to go to midnight mass, he was tied to the back bumper of the car. But he became not only my pony, but I passed him down, and he was passed down through the whole family, which is about 6 kids that rode Gladdy Pony. And then I turned to purebred American saddlebred horses and started raising them. But about the time I was about to graduate from high school, my American saddlebred stud, which I had raised from a colt, slid on a patch of ice and hit a rock and broke his leg. And although we sold him for a stud for another farm, I never did get any more horses. That was the end of the horses. But I was telling you that I'm a second generation Irish immigrant on my dad's side, and I had gone back over to Ireland a couple of years back and found the family farm where my great-granddad grew up and where my granddad grew up until he came across the ocean when he was about 17, and found some family relatives. We had dinner with them and a real pleasant visit. On the Swedish and Norwegian side, my grandmother was in a covered wagon when she was trained when she was young. They went from Sioux Falls out to the Black Hills, and the guide for the covered wagon train, sort of the leader, was her uncle, who had been in the Civil War. He was in Sherman's March to the Sea during the Civil War, and he was quite dashing, riding around on his horse, I guess, from what my grandma told me. Out in the middle of the state someplace at a trading post, they stopped, and the men were in trading, getting some supplies, and some Indian women came over and kidnapped my grandma's little sister. She was like 2 years old or so, and they were just fascinated by her blonde hair. So when the men came back, the women told them what had happened. The men took their pistols and they marched down through the Indian camp, checking teepee by teepee until they found that little girl and got her back. And then they spent that summer and the following year out in the Black Hills cutting timber for the houses and construction in Deadwood in the gold mining camps. And then they came back to Sioux Falls and settled down on the farm.
Would you like to tell us more about your grandparents?
Oh, I've got a lot of stories about my grandparents. My grandmother's grandparents, actually, when they settled in this area, they lived in what was called Sod City, which is out by Moorfield. It's north and a little bit west of Renner. And that quarter section of land was what was called a school section, belonged to the school, so nobody really farmed it or anything. So the early settlers, several of them, went out there and put up sod houses, and they lived in those until they got going on their own land and built houses out there. They were built completely out of sod. They cut squares of sod, stacked them up, and then they'd put poles across the roof and then put sod over the top of that, and that's what they lived in. On my father's side, my grandparents on my father's side, my granddad, who came over here when he was 17, if you remember, had the farmland, and he and his brother also had a bank in Millbank and one in Big Stone City. But at the end of what would have been World War I, the economy collapsed, and rather than foreclose on the farmers they had made loans to, they actually closed the bank. The bank went broke. So my granddad and his brother were set to sell everything off, land and bank and everything, and move back to Ireland, settle back in Ireland. but because of the bank breaking, they ended up staying in America. So I'm an American rather than an Irishman. My granddad had lost his wife when she had twins in childbirth, and back in those days they were out on the farm, and she was in pretty bad shape, and he was trying. They had a telephone. He was trying to call for help in town, but somebody had the telephone lines jammed up, so he couldn't get through. So he drove all the way into town, couldn't find the doctor. When he got back, she had passed away. So my dad and his brothers and sisters grew up with just Grandpa on the farm, and because he couldn't take care of them all the time, he would send them in to board at St. Mary's School in Del Rapids. The upper floor was a boarding area, boarding for kids going to school there. And my youngest aunt was so young that they have memories of her peeking in the classrooms because she was too young to go to school. So she just wandered around the school and peeked into classrooms to see who was there. Now, when I met your grandmother, the first thing I did was line her up with a blind date with a friend of mine that was in from Laverne, Minnesota for the evening. And we went to the movie. It was a Big Spider. It was a horror movie. And we got split up because the movie house was so crowded. So Grandma and her blind date were sitting several rows down in the movie house ahead of myself and my date and my other friend and his date. And when the Big Spider would come over the hill, we'd hear Grandma screaming like mad. And we found out after the movie it wasn't Grandma, it was the guy that I had lined her up with for a date. And she was so embarrassed that she wouldn't go near him again. Then later on I started dating her myself, and we were going steady from the time she was a junior and I was a senior in high school. So we've been tied together for a long time. Back to when we had the horses, and we're learning to ride the horses. Before I got my pony, my brother and I used to ride the work horses. Don't get in the light, Tom. And the horses were big, gentle, older work horses. And the only way we could get on them, we would toss an ear of corn in front of them, and they would reach down with their head to eat the corn, and we'd sit on their head. They'd lift their head up, and we'd slide down their neck, and then away we'd ride. We had to let them finish the corn first because they wouldn't move until after they finished that. But they were such big horses and such broad backs. We used to ride a mile over to our cousin's farm and play during the day, and then we'd ride them back in the afternoon. And they had such big broad backs that we could just lay down on their backs and go to sleep and wake up when they pulled into our farmyard. And I ran out of steam again.
Okay.
Okay.
One more horse story. When I was young, I suppose 4th grade, something like that, I had decided I was going to run away from home. I was upset. So I got my pony saddled up and ready to go, and surprisingly, my parents didn't object. In fact, Mom packed a lunch, and then they waved at me as I rode out the driveway on the way south to Texas.
What's so surprising about that?
And I think the pony and we went a long ways. We got about, I think, 5 miles down the road to the south before we decided, or the pony and I decided, that the food was better and the shelter was better back home. So we turned around and went back. I never did try and run away again because the folks didn't have any, they didn't try to stop me. One more story, Zach, about back in the old days on the farm. When we'd get bad weather in the winter out there on the farm, we'd get snowed in so the roads were drifted over. Just big snow drifts. And what we would do is that the neighbors about 2-3 miles up the road would start out with their stock truck. And they would dig their way out of their driveway and through the first snowdrift or two on the road. And then they'd get to the next neighbor's place, and the dad and the older boys would bring their shovels, and they'd come out and they'd jump in the truck and they'd dig their way through the snowdrifts until they got to our place, and they'd pick us up. And Dad and I and my older brother, we'd jump in with our shovels and we'd dig our way down to the next neighbors and pick them up. And we did that all the way to town. Now, we lived 2.5 miles from the highway, so we had a long ways to go. And we would dig and we would dig and we would dig. And there was one snowdrift I remember particularly after we got dug all the way to town. You could drive through that snowdrift in that stock truck, and we were 6 feet tall at the time, and you could reach up as high as you could, and you still couldn't reach the top of that snowdrift that we had dug a path through. Then we'd get to town, and all the farmers would go in and they'd stock up on groceries, and they'd go to the post office and they'd pick up all their mail, and then we'd start back, and he'd drop off every family at their house or at their farm until we got home, and then we had some groceries and mail, and we could survive for another week if we had to. Now, it's up to you.
Well, thanks for all your help.
You bet.
I don't know what to say.